Hey folks, Steve here with sort of a weird video for you today, maybe the first of many videos in a series to come, really around a problem that I know exists for a lot of other gamers, that, inevitably in the time you're playing war games or conflict simulations or board games or whatever, you eventually arrive to some point where you really want a game to exist that does not, or you like a game, but you think there's a different way to go about, you know, that game's mechanics to be a better game, and that, desired game just does not exist, right? And I find myself in want of a game that does not quite exist. And this video is kind of exploring the idea, and how I might resolve it. Because the other problem, inevitably, that happens is that you get to playing enough games and eventually someone starts to tinker around with their ideas for their own game. And here is where the intersection lies that, well, like many designers in the past, someone eventually gets to the point where they say, well, the only way this game's going to exist is if I design it. And so this is sort of a toe in the water to think through the game that I would like to exist, and what inspires it, and how I might even go about looking at it. So this is a very preliminary video, but just I want to use this space to kind of talk through it. And if you're watching and you're interested in seeing how things come along, leave a comment down below and let me hear your thoughts. Wouldn't mind some backboards, but I have some games on the table here in front of the camera, and I'm going to talk to each one quickly and kind of speak to how they all feed into my thoughts and what's going on in my mind and what we're really here to talk about today. So Here I Stand, which is an amazing game designed by Ed Beach that covers the Protestant Reformation, 1517 to 1555. Great game, fantastic game. One of the best games that exists, in my opinion. It just is fantastic. And if you read the designer notes, Ed Beach talks to basically having a game that he liked. I believe it was A Mighty Fortress, which was a game, an older game, Hex Encounter and mechanics, that covered the same time period. And it just didn't do what Ed wanted it to do. There were fun things about it, but it didn't quite meet what he wanted out of a game about the Protestant Reformation. And so what he did was he designed this game, right? And he, in effect, in some ways, totally made that older game obsolete, or created a game that hit all the same notes, but did it in a way that was much more conducive to players wanting to learn the game and play the game and really like the game. And of course, this is a game that has a really strong, dedicated following of people who really like it, and is sort of a success story. So while the game that I have in mind isn't going to be quite like Here I Stand, I think it stands as an example of what someone can do, right? You can say, well, there's this game, there's a lot of cool things I like about it, it covers the topic that I like, but it doesn't do what I really want it to do, and there are things I would like a game to be able to do instead, and have that work out, right? So I'm going to take this game away for a second, put it back on my shelf. So what else, right? What's the real thing I'm here to talk about? Well, let me reorder these a little bit. There is a game called Empires of the Middle Ages. Now, this is the Decision Games copy. There's an older version of the game. Some people prefer it. I think that the DG version is just fine for my purposes. This is a really interesting game. It covers the Middle Ages, go figure, from around the time of Charlemagne to right to the start of the Renaissance time period. And it's a fascinating time period, right? A lot of change. The feudal systems of Europe, or what we might refer to as feudal, but there are so many variations. A really interesting time period. And Empires of the Middle Ages does a pretty interesting job. In fact, it does a lot of cool things that I really, really like. It has mechanics around converting the religion of specific spaces on the map. That start one religion, you can convert it to other religions. You can mend or cause the schism between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches of Christianity. You can attack your opponent's areas. You can raid it. You can improve it. You can try to increase sort of like the prosperity of the regions that you might control. And you also have the ability to have diplomatic ties or claims to regions, even if you don't own them yet. And so that's where you get into friction between players and sort of that like monarch versus monarch dealing of claims over certain territory. And I really like all of that. I really like what this game can do. But the problem with Empires of the Middle Ages is that it is awfully janky. With the DG version, they added a bunch of like expanded content, but that expanded content doesn't, it's been grafted onto the game, and it doesn't always make sense, and it's a little clunky. And when you actually get the map out on the board and you've got all the tokens and the markers out, it ends up just being really fiddly, and trying to teach new players how to play it. I mean, it's a whole thing. And some of this is because it's a product of its times. The original Empires of the Middle Ages came out, I think, in the 80s. And even this version took that original game and sort of changed some of the components and the artwork, and it added some new cards to change some of the game mechanics, but it is still basically a game from the 80s, and I want a game very much like Empires of the Middle Ages, but something different. So, in the analogy of a mighty fortress to Here I Stand, Empires of the Middle Ages is a mighty fortress. It is a game that is awfully close to what I want it to be, but does not quite meet what I want. I want smoother mechanics. I want a few mechanics to be a little more straightforward and smoothed out. I want it to be easier to teach, and I want the systems to be more straightforward to games that are, more in the modern context, or using mechanics that folks are a little more familiar with. One of the egregious things about this game is that you can perform a broad set of different actions, which is really interesting, but how you resolve them are using these cards that you can't look at until you flip one to use one for an action, and you have to look up on a chart that's printed on the card whether or not you succeed based on investing money and your monarch's ability to do the action. And you have to read sort of this mathematical equation notation to see if you succeed. And the crazy thing to me is that the actual mathematical equation, like less than sign or greater than sign, if you remember, duck facing right, duck facing left, from math class, they get the notation wrong. It's not even correct notation for the equations that they're using. So it just becomes a real garbled mess. And I know a lot of folks really like this game, and again, I still do too, but I want something that is very much like it, but better. And that's really what I want to do. I want to put together a game that is in the same sort of niche, that does similar things, but does them in a more cohesive and better manner, and would hopefully provide not just a lot of fun gameplay opportunities, but abilities for easy creation of variant rules and different things, so folks can really get a lot of utility out of the game. And it would probably be a pretty big game that would have plenty of components, but how do we get there, right? And what does it take to design a game? There's folks out there who are veteran game designers that have their own methodology. I've not designed a game, and I can only look to games that I like and try to figure out, well, what are they doing that I like? What makes it playable? How do I avoid the pitfalls of creating a game with too much chrome, or maybe not enough chrome, or, in my effort to make the game the way I want it to be, am I creating a game that suffers from the same problems of being fiddly or not easily digestible? Those are all the big pitfalls, but, in this preliminary thought process, some of that stuff may not matter a whole lot. But what are some other games that kind of are going to feed into the inspiration here, right, for what I'm thinking? Again, this is the core element, right? I want to create a game that starts with Charlemagne, or roughly the time of Charlemagne, and goes all the way through, almost 1500, and really make it so that you're able to play in different, eras or periods within those 700 years. Or even a grand campaign, but there's a lot of pitfalls with the grand campaign too, just like Empires of the Middle Ages. Well, I have other games that can kind of help feed into the thought process. One, of course, is the sort of venerable Europa Universalis. So this is a game that this is the original from way back. The game that was inspired, I think, by Empires of the Middle Ages, and then went on to inspire the PC game version of the game, and everything that spawned out of that. But what Europa Universalis does, interestingly, is that it has scenarios that you can play that are sub-periods within a long period of time. And in some ways, like, this game would pick up where Empire of the Middle Ages or my game to be leaves off, right? You start sort of in that late 1400s, early 1500s, and you play up through the French Revolution. So much of this is like building a game that does a very good job of this type of gameplay, where you can play different time periods within the game's parameters, and then also play a grand campaign. And this game, of course, has a lot of different aspects to it, probably even bigger than my design would want to include, because it has like tons of different types of events that you look up in a booklet, and all these different types of things. It covers the whole world, where I would be focused primarily on Europe and the Middle East. But I think this game feeds my thoughts in terms of, I want something that can be grand if you want it to be grand, or can be more focused if you're just wanting to play like a tournament scenario in any other game, or something you might play as a half-day convention play. You can play one scenario, or you can leave the game set up and play a grand campaign over the course of multiple sessions, meeting every once in a while with your buddies in your garage or whatever, kind of like World in Flames, WIF, or other games like it, where you could really play through all of those years of history and see the different changes, the dynamic events that unfold. And some of this is like, Europa Universalis has events that are triggered or happen that change kind of the game tempo. I similarly want something like that. Empires of the Middle Ages has stuff like that as well. I think event cards is probably how I would want to look at doing it. But again, a lot of inspiration here. And then, in a similar fashion, there are games, and I should order them this way in terms of chronology, that do, again, similar types of things. So you have Pax Romana by Richard Berg, that covers 300 BC to 50 BC. And you can play smaller scenarios, you can play the whole time period. But in this game, each turn is like 25 years. So you can do a lot of things as a nation state, an empire, an ancient empire, in 25 years. I similarly would want the game to cover, if you're going to cover 700 years, you have to decide how much can be covered in a given turn or a player action. And I like the idea of having turns represent 10 years, but have each player in a scenario, you're going to get to go multiple times in a turn that is 10 years long, but basically you're moving in those big increments, and you can have pretty wide affecting changes in 10 years, but you can't do, an infinite number of things in 10 years. So the tempo of the game has to kind of match that tempo. Imperium Romanum is another game to get inspiration from. I mean, this is, I'm showing the second version. I have the third up on my shelf. This was easier to grab. The thing that Imperium Romanum does is it gives a lot of different scenarios, like dozens of scenarios, covering all these different aspects from basically the time of Marius and Sulla up through the fragmentation of the Western Roman Empire. And so you could kind of see this, the game I'm talking about, or Empires of the Middle Ages now, picks up where this leaves off, right? So there's this sandwich time between Imperium Romanum, getting into those early, Dark Ages, to the Middle Ages, and then early Renaissance, where Europa Universalis picks up. There's this segment, right? And again, today, Empire of the Middle Ages fills it, but it doesn't quite do what I want. But these games, I think, kind of feed into the stuff going on in my mind about, like, how do we make the game work, right? What incentives do you have? How should the game operate? And something I really like about Pax Romana is that there are ways to get victory points that are not just fighting. You're working to develop your civilization. and achieve certain things. I like that idea. I mean, in the context of Empire of the Middle Ages, players get victory points for converting provinces and for basically solidifying their realm. I want to do something similar, but I need to do it in a slightly different way, really, for the game to stand on its own and be be satisfying, right? I mean, you could create a conflict simulation that's like Imperial Romanum 2, where it's so much a simulation that you lose the game aspect. And I want to be careful of that. I do want it to be a bit of a simulation. If I have to use design by effect to do the things that I want to do, then I'll do that. But I still want it to be a game, and that's the tough thing, right? Or you could go the other way and have it be too much of a game and not really provide the incentives that the historical actors have, right? So there has to be the right carrots and sticks and the right independent action that a player's taking, not in conflict with other players, but things that will draw players into conflict with one another eventually, so that the game stays interactive and that the players feel a sense of progression, like in Pax Romana, where you're building cities, you're expanding. In this hypothetical game, it's really about gaining control of lands, ensuring that your dynasty or family have the proper, recognition of that ownership, and then making sure that it's prosperous, having a prosperous kingdom, so that you're reaping, ultimately the tax benefits as the monarch and becoming more rich and having money to do the things you want to do. So thinking through that and what I want the game to be like is really nestled in those ideas. And I've been thinking about this hypothetical game for years at this point. I've thought about all the different ways to do it, what the game could be like, what it should be like, and there's still so much more to really think about. I think I'm at a stage where I'm starting to take notes and just think about, like, this is how I want it to work. And like, I don't know, if you have an IT background, there's this concept of pseudocode. You're not writing actual code for a program, you're simply writing pseudocode, so the syntax doesn't need to be accurate, but what you're just saying is, okay, I want it to do this, bop, 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 and you're describing, you're kind of working out the logic flow. And I think I'm at that stage, right? I want these mechanics. This is how I want it to work. And I can do these little snippets and fragments of the game design and say, this is how it should work, this is the way I would like it to work. And then over time, I can start to pull those ideas together into coherent actions. And so much of it is, there's playtesting required. There's adjusting the balance, and does the economy make sense, right? How do players get money, for instance? Like, money has to be a thing. That has to be part of the action economy. How do you get money? How do you ensure that someone doesn't run away with too much money? How do players spend money and lose money and maintain things so that you can't just save up a bunch of money over time and get to blow it in some weird, uneven, unrealistic, illogical thing? All of that has to be worked out through the design. And again, even if using Empires of the Middle Ages as a skeleton, if we're really looking at the game design to stand on its own and to be developed in some ways from the ground up, maybe with some, again, ideas that are foundational from other games, all of that nitty-gritty stuff has to be worked out. So I'm going to list off some other thoughts that kind of are feeding into this, just to kind of help organize my thoughts. I like the idea in Empires of the Middle Ages of independent areas. I think that's a really important thing. So just to kind of show on the back of this box for Empires of the Middle Ages, you have regions, right? Each region, it's possible for each individual region to be considered independent. So not part of a player power that province is by itself. And in the context of the medieval world or the Middle Ages, feudal Europe, it could be that the ruler of that area, whatever title that they might have, noble title or what have you, are an independent polity, or their ties to a liege lord are so tenuous that functionally in the game they would be independent. And those would allow, from a game perspective, allows players an opportunity to play out different mechanics like military affairs and stuff like that, without aggravating other players, to kind of build out a foundation for their kingdom or their region or whatever. And the idea being that these independent areas at game start or in whatever scenario you're playing might be valuable, they may not be valuable themselves, they might be useful as a stepping stone to another region, or to get a good port on a sea so you can do naval affairs, that kind of thing, I think is really important. Because when you look at the medieval world and you look at maps and you try to make sense of the relationships between the landowning nobles that are really getting land from the king or whoever is supposed to be the ultimate owner of that land, and the peasants who work it, it is easy to fall into the trap of believing that it's like in like the game Crusader Kings, where it's like, oh, a count who answers to a duke who answers to a king. I mean, the reality is it was much more complex and not neat and clean like that. So ultimately you have to be able to look at these little independent polities and just abstract it to a degree to say, this is independent, or it is part of the player kingdom of France, and so the player controls that, but they don't control these other areas. And that sort of thing where a place is either independent, belongs to a player, or it belongs to some sort of minor power or non-player faction. And I like that idea too. So you would have basically different tiers of polities represented in the game. So again, single space, potentially independent, might get squashed, but it's there as a roadblock or a something, low-hanging fruit for a player to grab to add to their empire. Then you would have non-player factions, or I might call them minor kingdoms or minor powers. These would be break-off factions that would either come onto the board via an event card given a certain time period in the game, reflecting some political upheaval or entry like the Mongols arriving in the east, and that those minor powers would have capabilities very similar to a player power. Independents would have no action of themselves. They would ideally be pretty stationary, where the minor factions would operate on some logic, either bot or player-driven, to act on the game map. And I could do something similar to Imperium Romanum, where the player whose capital is furthest from the capital of the minor power gets to control it when it activates for actions. That sort of thing, I think, could be done. And it's really important to have something like that on the map so that you avoid a situation where if a player power is isolated or is on the edge of the map, maps are constructions, right? But the world doesn't end at the edge of a map. You kind of have to acknowledge that the world doesn't end in the Middle East. There's, areas to the east of Syria, for instance, that would impact things happening in Syria. And so these minor powers can act as a controlling force, as an opposing force, even for players who might be geographically isolated, and that gives them an opportunity to act without the danger of other player interaction. So I think minor power is super important, and then the next tier up obviously being the player powers, which have the most capability. They would have the power of the players, driving their activities, getting a lot more activations, doing things to the player's design. I do like the idea of a big, large map, like Empire of the Middle Ages. I'm looking at different books that I own, like The Holy Roman Empire by Peter Wilson, which has some good maps kind of showing the different provinces of the Holy Roman Empire that could be used to create what the map will look like in terms of what areas count as their own areas. I like the idea of multiple scenarios, for sure. So, for instance, there might be a scenario about Charlemagne and his early conquest. It would maybe be a tutorial or a two-player game. But then you would have scenarios that are set during the Crusades and would be, more 4 to 6 player games, and have the Crusade events be a major mechanic in that scenario, not the only mechanic in that scenario, but just being, something that differentiates that scenario from, say, a period scenario set during the Viking Age, and that the Viking Age scenarios would have their own mechanics, again, not overburdening the game with like huge, in-depth, complex mechanics, but straightforward things that change the tempo so that each scenario feels different because there are different things going on, reflecting the history. I do think that a grand campaign is a nice thing to shoot for. So Empire of the Middle Ages had one. It ultimately wasn't very balanced. Imperium Romanum 2 basically gave up on the idea of a grand campaign, and so did the third edition. But I do think that it's something I think I could make work, and a lot of that comes down to an event deck. I really like the idea of an event deck. I don't necessarily want the game to be card-driven, though I thought about that at some point. Maybe something like Empire of the Sun, but I'm steering more towards maybe a chit pool or just player action driven thing. But that event cards would be drawn and either played for a global effect automatically or held for a player-specified action when it makes sense to do so. I like that, and you can feed the deck with standard cards that cover any time period that your scenario is covering, Grand Campaign included, but then have period-specific cards that would be seeded into the deck, so you get these momentous changes that occur. Again, things like the Mongol invasion would come in the 1200s, for instance. You would not have to worry about a Mongol invasion until that time period if you were playing the Grand Campaign, but you would have other things going on, right? You would have the Vikings in the 900s, you would have the Crusades going on in the Crusades, like all that kind of stuff. Things that happen outside the player's control would be introduced with event cards. I do like the idea of religious mechanics, so the schism between Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox, I mentioned that earlier. The ability to see this, make the schism happen or mend the schism, I think is really interesting. That's something I'd want to retain, though I might want to change how it happens in my game compared to Empire of the Middle Ages. Getting victory points for converting people to your religion, I think, it makes a lot of sense. I think that's a good mechanic to include. Having some sort of cultural mechanic, I think, is important. So, Empires of the Middle Ages does languages, and so you have different regions that are languages, language-dependent, language families. It's really a stand-in for culture, and so I do think having that makes a lot of sense. It is another aspect of the design of Empire of the Middle Ages I really, really like, and that regions would have specific cultures. In the scenarios, you wouldn't change them. In the Grand Campaign, you have the potential with investment to change that. And if you're ruling over a kingdom that has many different cultures and many different religions, that there will be penalties for that. So there would be a logical limit to overexpansion that you would have to slow down and commit resources to trying to incorporate newly conquered territory more fully into your kingdom. But that cultural conversion would be something very rare, again, only seen in a Grand Campaign context, much like Empire of the Middle Ages. Things like rebellions, heresies, I think that's all really good stuff. Also, Empire of the Middle Ages, but a lot like any game of this type. Pax Romana has civil wars. Those types of things that are either random or can be induced, that kind of help make the game a little more chaotic, things you have to plan for or deal with. I do like having, for instance, like a minor vassal rebel somehow and taking one or two provinces and putting them into a minor faction state or some opposed state of existence to the player who originally controlled them. I think that's really important, and in fact might be a pivot point for inter-player activity. So if one player has a rebellion, maybe another player has the opportunity to support that rebellion, and another aspect of interplay there. I do like the idea of player activity being driven by their leaders. So in Empires of the Middle Ages and Europa Universalis, there is a concept of leaders and leader quality, rated for like military, administrative, and diplomatic. I do like that. That's something I'd like to keep, but I don't know that I like the idea of just rolling for it. And I've sort of tossed around ideas between either having some sort of leader deck that you draw from, and then that's your leader, or drawing from the deck, reading off the values of the card, recording them on a player card, so saying that's who your leader is, but then the card goes back in the deck so that somebody else can draw from the same deck, from the same pool of potential leaders. or counters. Counters with leader values on them, much like any sort of war game we're used to playing, point-to-point map or something where a leader has 3 values on it. You could similarly pull a chit out of a cup, and that's your leader. So I kind of want to figure out a way to deal with that. So, leaders would die based on certain factors, either time or action-based, just like these other games that I'm drawing inspiration from. But I kind of want to avoid just rolling dice for that. I want it to be a little more controlled, just so you don't have somebody who's just rolling crap all the time, and that's going to imbalance the game. That they have some decent chance. It's still percent based or it's still random chance, but something a little more controlled. I like that, just so that somebody can't be hosed all the time. They can get a leader who's good at something, so they have something to focus on. And having that variety of actions, I think, is important. So if you have a leader who's not so good at administration, but really good at diplomacy, or really good at warfare, you have warfare things you can be doing, both offensively and defensively. That for diplomatic things, there are things you can do sort of quote-unquote offensively and defensively. That would be things like arranging marriages to independent areas, so you get a familial tie to it, or working to get a claim on a particular area, so that you can eventually incorporate it into your kingdom. That variety of actions, I think, is very important, just so the players have more things to do. I think Here I Stand does a good job of providing players a nice menu of things that they can do. I like that. Something similar, like Empire of the Middle Ages, like Here I Stand, like other games, give the players options for things to do. And then, there's, I think, a lot of things that, I'd want to look at in terms of what are all the different states of a territory or a region. How do you invest in a region, right? And I have this concept of prosperity. In Empire of the Middle Ages, you have like a social state and you have population. The population doesn't change a whole lot, but the social status does, and it sort of reflects some areas getting built up and more settled and potentially more urbanized over time. But then you would have raid actions that would decrease that. I kind of want to merge population and social status into a prosperity value, just so the game's a little more streamlined, and you really are looking at things as saying like Paris or Ile-de-France, whatever we decide to call it in my game, starts fairly prosperous, and that whatever values are on the board at game start can still be decreased, can still be increased, but there are boundaries around how much they can increase. And then determining like how does that translate to victory points, I'm not sure about. I think Empire of the Middle Ages has a thing where you're basically looking at like the social status of a province plus 3 is the victory point value for that place. So this really incentivizes some balance of gaining territory / developing your territory. It's worth doing both, or some to certain degrees. I do like that idea. I'm not sure what the balance would be for my game, but there might be incentives to say like who has the most prosperous region on the whole map, and there might be a few key places where that's really valuable. Making it harder to increase prosperity is something I think is probably needed from a balance standpoint. So, getting one region up to 1 above its natural prosperity might not be too hard. Getting it 2 above its natural prosperity might be really difficult and gets progressively harder the more you try to increase it. But there are benefit, there's that benefit to increasing it because you don't have to invade another territory, which, again, we talk about the balance of the economy. Warfare should be very expensive. Having standing armies would be very expensive. I'm thinking right now not having like armies on the map that move, so similar to Empire of the Middle Ages, where it's a little more abstract, but basically for a military campaign, which again, you have to think of this as happening over the course of a couple of years. Every player action is effectively a couple of years. That you're going on a campaign and you're going to levy troops from your region, or you're going to pay for mercenaries. So if you're going to do a military action, you're going to target someplace for that military action, and then you're going to either use levies and levy troops from the regions you control, and you'll get a certain amount of combat power for that. Then, if you have money, you can also spend some for some mercenaries, and that will give you some combined military value. And then combat would probably involve some like 2d6 plus modifiers based on your troops and your mercenaries, and that would give you some combat value to be compared to the defender combat value. It's that kind of stuff I need to still think through. What do I want combat to be like? How do you, what do you need to plan for? How often should you be doing military actions, and what are the constraints? There's an aspect of this game that I'd like to have where, in the time period of Charlemagne or early Middle Ages, you would have a lot of levied troops being a primary source of your military power. But over time, as states got more centralized, you had the greater potential for armies based on mercenary troops more so than levied troops, and in some cases professional standing armies that could potentially exist. And I would like that transition to somehow happen, and I want to tie it to the change over time. So if you're playing an early Middle Ages scenario, you're more likely, and I'm not sure exactly how the game is going to incentivize this, but you're more likely, ideally, to be using levied troops for military actions, whereas a late game scenario, you would be likely, maybe because your economy is developed enough that it's less of a hit on your economy to use money that you've accrued than to levy troops, which might impact your ability to get resources and money from that region if you've levied troops from it, is maybe one way to do it. Where late game scenarios, you're going to have more mercenaries, more standing armies, and you're paying for those somehow, rather than levying, which might be free or cheaper, but slows down your economy. I think something like that would be really interesting. And then if you're playing the grand campaign, that transition would happen over time, likely as a function of just, in general, kingdom regions becoming more prosperous over time as things are built up and urbanized. That, again, if you're levying from Normandy or something, you would get so many combat points. But if you do that, maybe you're not getting the money from Normandy, and that the money from Normandy is going to keep, over time, Normandy is going to get more developed, and you're going to get a lot more money for it. It'll be better to simply use money that you're getting from Normandy to pay for troops when you need it. And there's that element of, you can pull from levies if you have to, but ideally, if you've marshaled your economy well, or you've marshaled your money well, you're instead, keeping a war chest built up, and when you have military actions, then, you're spending out of that eventually instead. So there's all those kinds of things. I'd really like to figure out how all of that happens, how these things start to become built out. What are things people can spend money on besides military matters? Because can they build improvements? Can they invest in certain regions? And what does that really look like from a game perspective? Empire of the Middle Ages has some stuff that you can build, like cathedrals and universities. And I kind of like what those do, but there's certain constraints around it I'm just not sure about. So it's that kind of stuff, really trying to figure out how do you build that game economy so that all these parts work together, right? You're creating marriages, you're getting claims, you're incorporating territory in your kingdom, you're trying to quell unrest and rebellions, you're levying troops or taxing areas which might cause problems, but you might need to get out of a jam. You're dealing with opposing players, you're dealing with the times, whatever timely events are going on, minor powers pressuring you. I want all of that, so it's not, you're getting this game experience even more so than just, I'm moving stuff around the map or I'm putting markers down, that you're really, fighting against multiple factors, and again, player-driven action to try to do well. And the only other thing to mind that I would want to bring up as I explain my thoughts on this, is I do like the idea of, and this is sort of something from Time of Crisis and other games, where I don't want the winner to be determined at the end. I like the idea of determining victory over time, representing the prestigiousness of your kingdom or your dynasty or whatever you want to refer to the player and what they're embodying. So that, like, if you're, let's say you're Byzantium or something, you're the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, that, if you've all of a sudden had a bunch of crappy turns, but you had some really great turns early in the game, especially the Grand Campaign, I don't want that player to lose just because they had a bad last couple of turns. It's more about if they've played well through the whole game, that's going to be balanced against other players who may have had bad, crappy periods and better periods. And then the scenarios would be short enough and balanced enough that it wouldn't really matter so much. But that, each turn, each 10-year turn, you're going to count up victory points and record victory points. And I think Pax Romana is a little bit like that too, where you're trying to get every turn, it's worthwhile trying to get the best victory points that you can, because over time they're going to build up and be compared at the end, rather than just, like in Here I Stand, I'm at 24 victory points, everybody else is at 19, I guess I win. At the end, it's the same problem with a map, right? The world doesn't end at the map, and time doesn't end at the end date. But it's over, if we're looking at the lens of the game that we would seek to design here, across those 700 years, or whatever it is, how well did that kingdom endure the times? How well did it marshal its forces? How well did the ruling family, expand its dynasty and take control of different areas, that sort of thing. I think that's the other way I would kind of want to rate the game in terms of how to play it, so that it's not, someone doesn't feel like in the early game, if they're having a bad time, that they're going to lose the game. They've got plenty of time to work with, or that it doesn't matter if you have one bad turn. You've got opportunities. I like that. Or that, at the very end, someone can't just fumble the football and lose the whole game, that there's still, every turn matters, every turn there's opportunity, that kind of thing I really like. So, yeah, from here, I don't know what happens next. It could be a long time before I do another video on this, and as I just slowly work to, sketch out the fragments and the brainstorming bits of the game and what it should look like and what it can do, we'll talk to it here. I guess one other thing I should mention, another game that helps inspire what I'm thinking through is Richard Berg's Medieval. This is the version from HGN Games, and there's a lot of stuff in this game too that I really like in terms of trying to portray the medieval world. This does it at a very, very high level, and there's some things about it that I don't necessarily like, because it's not a good simulation game, but it does incorporate some things that I think are really useful. So, I don't know. I'm kind of getting to the point where I'm rambling, but yeah, all these games, right? These long games that cover broad swaths of history. There's only so many of them, and a lot of them are great. But there's one that I think could exist that does better than Empires of the Middle Ages and covers that medieval period to a much more fun and interesting degree. And I really would like to put it together one day. The great challenge being, I saw a great graphic one time that showed, here's a big square of games that are designed, and then a smaller rectangle within that rectangle. These are the games that are picked up by a publisher potentially as a potential product, and then here's a smaller rectangle of here are the games that actually get published. And maybe all of this is for naught. Maybe it's a game that will be, forever in existence from a, Steve's prototype kind of form, but maybe someday it could be published if I manage to do a good enough job with it. So in the future, if I'm looking at something and I think it's worthwhile talking about, I will do another video in these sort of designer diary vids in a playlist that folks can watch over time, and maybe several years from now we'll look back at this video and kind of see the seed of whatever product is in somebody's hands. I think that'd be really interesting to see. I don't know if anyone's ever done this like I'm doing here, talking through the design of a game in these stages, but a lot of work to come. Maybe when I get a prototype map put together, start looking at it, and we'll start figuring it out. So anyway, if you stuck through all 45 minutes of this video, kudos to you. I thank you for being willing to listen to me for almost an hour. If you've got thoughts about this, or you've got considerations you think would be interesting for a game that I'm describing, let me know in the comments section down below. And maybe someday we'll get to a point where I'll get a Vassal module and we'll get people playtesting it. That'd be a lot of fun. I know folks, like to get engaged. That'd be a great way to do it. So if you like this video, hit like. If you want to see more in this series, hit subscribe. If you want to see other videos that I do, hit subscribe. I'm sure if you're watching this video, you may already be subscribed for that matter. So I guess that's all good. And until next time, guys, take care. Keep on gaming.